Hello, George Hepworth here, Grover Park Consulting. We're ready to continue our journey through the redevelopment or reproduction of the PowerApps application called Mike's Mobile Library. In the first installments, we gave you an introduction to the environments in which this application runs, the desktop and the browser or smart device, and a little bit about the table structure. We don't really need to go into depth on the table design because as Access developers we're well aware of how tables have to be set up following the principles of normalization, and the ones that we looked at in the SharePoint lists were designed that way. So today we're going to take a look at setting up a development copy of this existing application in order to begin the process of reproducing it as a project with our group. What you're looking at here on the screen, of course, is the actual current production version of it that I have been developing for some time, but we're going to start over with a new development copy. And as developers, we know there are certain things we want to do to set up a viable development environment. Let's start then by looking at two features in the PowerApps application that are going to enable or facilitate, I should say, probably facilitate rather than enable, this development version. First of all, we have a screen called the Options screen, SCR Options. You'll notice that it has three labels on it, three header labels on it, with different colors and different labels. The production label, the development label, and the test label. Now, I am not going to copy those labels onto all of those forms or all of those screens. Rather than copy all of those header labels and labels on the forms or the screens all throughout the entire application, we're going to take advantage of a feature that PowerApps has, which you will immediately recognize as being a corollary or a parallel to what we're used to doing in our Access relational databases on the desktop, and that is the onStart event. OnStart event is very similar to the AutoExec macro in an Access relational desktop application. So I'm going to start by reviewing very quickly. We have three sets of colors for production, development, and test. This is the default color for labels, the selected list item default background color, and an alternate label where I want to show something slightly different. Let's see how that actually works with the onStart event that sets up all of these various options. We can create a color scheme for our PowerApps applications by setting variables and referring to those variables throughout the application. For example, the first one here is the variable screen fill. We set the variable called screen fill to the value of the fill on the options screen. If we go back to the options screen and shrink this up, the fill is white on this options screen. Now, for Access developers, fill corresponds to back color, the back color property of forms and reports that we're familiar with. So we're going to set the default value of the screens in all throughout the application to the same fill or back color that is defined for this options screen. If we go back again to the onStart we have a variable called label fill. We set the value of var label fill to the fill for a label called label GPC colors. That label is also found on the options screen. It is called label GPC colors. Notice that I'm not qualifying this label by referring to the screen on which it is located. Unlike Access, where we can use the same name for a label or a field or virtually anything that has to do with an object, we can use that same name on different objects throughout our Access application. Every object in a PowerApps application has a unique name. So if I call this particular label on this particular screen LBL, or label GPC colors, that is globally unique. And anything that refers to LBL or label GPC colors is going to refer to this and only this label. That's an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is, of course, that I can use that in my onStart event to refer to that color without having to qualify where that label comes from. The downside, of course, is that every time I create a label, I have to come up with a unique, different name for it, and that gets kind of tedious to have to do that. But it's a worthwhile trade-off, in my opinion, after having worked with PowerApps applications for a while. So I have two options. This is the one that's set for production. I have two other options, the test and the development. If I set the value of label fill to the screen options title fill, it will change from this blue color label, not fill. Change from this dark blue color to whatever the color is set on that label on the options screen. And I'm going to do that now. First of all, I have to comment out, and we do comments by putting in 2 forward slashes. You'll notice that it immediately pops up an error because it's doing error checking live as I work, and then the error went away. I have to reset now because I have commented out all the possible values of label fill, or var label fill. This no longer is able to pick that up, and so I have to give it something else, and that will be this version. Oops, went too far. And now it says, okay, now I'm going to use this color, which is an orange. Orange is bright enough to be highly noticeable without being overly bright or garish. So now, if I go back to my startup screen, you'll see that my labels, the back color or the fill has gone black. That's because I've invalidated the original var variable for that color, and I have to run the onStart macro again, or the onStart event, to restore that variable. And then now, instead of having to copy or change every single label throughout the entire application, I can simply change that one value, run the onStart a second time, and now everything in the application has updated to show my development color scheme. Let's look at this. You'll notice that when I select an item here, its fill changes. That's also coming from the options screen. And that's this label here, the selected item. Its fill scroll up until we find fill, is set to dark cyan. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I can do the same thing. I can comment it out and change it. And now, if I run the OnStart again, launch the application, go back to home, pick it up, and now my selected item will pick up the light blue color. And again, this will be the same throughout the entire application. I don't have to go to each gallery individually and change that. It's a way to set global or thematic colors in our application. That's one aspect of using the OnStart event in conjunction with the options screen to set up my environment for either production, development, or test. Test would create a third color. Other variables for the labels picks up. So we have the fill, which is the background, the color, which is the forecolor. The warning color picks its color from this label, and so on. The application title. Right now, I'm working in dev and test. And I have to apologize, in my first 3 videos, I actually had failed to set this back to production, so I was showing my mobile library, even though I was in the production environment at that point. If I want to identify this as the production version, again, uncomment this one, comment out this one. It blows that away because it's lost that value and it doesn't know what to call it. Run the OnStart again. And now we're looking at Mike's mobile library, but I want this to be the development version. And I'll set it back, run the OnStart again, move this out of the way, and now we're back to my mobile library. One more section. As I mentioned previously, I'm storing the images in an Azure Blob Storage account. So this variable allows me to refer to a shortened version. This is like an alias or a shortened version shortcut to the full URL to that blob storage account area. I use the path length in a couple of places to shorten down the full path to that image to show only the image name itself. And you'll see that when we get to that part of the application. This is an interesting problem that I encountered in working with SharePoint lists. As you know, the only way we can create a mechanism, or actually I should say that slightly differently, the only mechanism we have available to designate referential integrity between primary and foreign keys in SharePoint lists is to set up the lookup fields mechanism. To my surprise and disappointment, I learned that we have to actually break open that lookup field using this connector reference to get to the values of the foreign key inside that lookup. And so again, this connector reference is required to do that, and I set up an OData variable rather than have to repeat this every time that I can use that. Then we set up some defaults. The cover photo link, we set it to none. The name, we set it to blank. We set the value of a filter for genres to 0, publishers to 0, media type, and so on. This is a number, by the way, referring to the data type. This is text. Notice that the way I initially define that variable determines what data type it has. So by saying initially that it is a text string none with the quotes in front of it and behind it, that means it is going to be handled as a text value, a number value, and a record. By giving it the initial value of a blank record, it becomes a record. This is increasingly important as we start working with multiple screens with multiple uses of these variables. We have to keep in mind that if we're going to do something, we have to be sure we're using the correct data type in conjunction with one of these variables. Now, in the onStart event, we also do some work with collections. And in a prior set of videos called Fooling or Tricking PowerApps into Loading 10,000 Records, I talked about the use of collections. And I'll walk through these very quickly here. We'll revisit this later as we apply this concept into some of our screens. We use the clear collect method. It clears out or dumps whatever is in that collection and refills it with new values. We set the publication genre ID to 0, the genre to all genres, and we set the sort order to 0. That means this collection now has one record in it with these 3 values. Then we add to that initial collection of one record additional records from a table. Clear collect dumps and refills. Collect adds new records to that collection. So we're going to take the table called publication genre. We're going to add all of the items from that table to this collection, except for these 4 fields, which are some of the fields that SharePoint adds by default to new SharePoint lists. I don't use them anywhere in this application, so I just throw them away by using the drop columns. We do drop columns, tell which data source we're going to drop them from, and then list them. We do the same thing with media condition. Set up a 0 item, 0 record for any, and then add the rest of the table, the rest of the fields from this data source. Clear collect, dump and refill, collect, add new. Publisher, same procedure. Media type, same procedure. And now we have a set of collections that we can use based on, mostly these are our lookup fields, lookup tables, the genre, the media type, and so on. Now, we're going to create a master collection of all publications. I previously talked about this and why we would want to do it in the series of 3 videos called Tricking PowerApps into Loading 10,000 Records. And we do this because it allows us to bypass the 2,000 record or 500 record limit on delegation that brings in no more than 500 or no more than 2,000 records. That's configurable between 500 and 2,000 into PowerApps environment at a single time. Now there's a lot of qualifications that go with that. But the idea here is that if our library, if the catalog of our library exceeds that 2,000 limit of records for delegation, we will have a publications collection internally in our PowerApps environment that will hold as many records as we actually have in our underlying table. And we will not use that except for those cases where we just want to have all of them available at a single time. So we clear this collection, clear this collection. That means we don't put anything back into it. We just zero it out. We clear the publications itself. And again, for details, you can refer back to those previous videos. We find the first record in our table and the last record, and that gives us the span. First record will be the lowest ID value in that table. The last record will be the highest. The difference between those two will be the maximum possible number of records in that table at that point in time. That may or may not be equal to the actual number. It's the maximum, because if you add and delete records in between, of course, then that will be a smaller total. We walk through, var iterations is a variable we're going to set. We determine that by taking the last record, subtract the first record, and that again gives us our maximum. Divide that by the record limit, which is 2,000. We're bringing records in chunks of 2,000, and then add 1. That tells us how many times we have to go through the total number of records in this application to completely account for all of the records. At this point, it is 2, based on the number of records currently in my publications table. The max event count is 52. We again dump and refill this collection. This is based on the tally table. And as I scroll down through this list, you'll see that it reaches 100, which, as we saw in the previous video, the number of records in our tally table. Okay, we have this event temp, which is based on the tally table. And as we saw when we looked at the interface, on the access side, we have a table with 100 records in it. This is a counter that we can use to iterate one at a time through all of our records. As I said before, PowerApps doesn't have a true looping capability on record sets, and this is a way to accomplish a similar thing in the PowerApps environment. We use the for all method to accomplish that same thing. So for all method allows us to go through this event table, and we're going to select only the number of tally counts we need to account for each of the iterations. And as we calculated up above the number of iterations, that was 2. So our event temp will be filtered down from 100 to 2. For this for all recursion. And we're going to collect in this recursion count the number of times we're going to have to go through. And so that's going to have to be 2 times. And now we're at a point where we can collect the spans of records within each recursion. So we have 2 recursions, and each one of those is going to be the first item and the last item. First item and the last item. And as you can see, it's basically taking the 52 and dividing it by 2 and saying in the first pass we'll pick 1 through 26, the second pass 27 through 52. And again, refer back to those initial videos to get the logic behind making that happen. The final step in this process is to collect all of our publications into this collection. And this essentially duplicates the total number of records in the publication table in a collection inside PowerApps. Keeping in mind the reason we're doing this is that if the total number of records in the publications table exceeds our 2,000 limit that's supported by delegation, our collection internally will have the total number of records, and we can actually use that to account for all of the books or videos or DVDs, whatever we have in our library, without having to worry about missing some because the delegation limit is 2,000. Again, we have the location of the blob storage account, the path length. Okay, so now we've seen the onStart event and how we use it to set up our environment with the color scheme and the global variables and the initial state of some variables and these collections. The next step is going to be creating a new PowerApps application and starting to bring from our production environment here into that new development environment each of the pieces we need as we go. This seems like a good place to stop. In the next installment, we will look at creating a new version of the application in a development status. We'll start by copying this options screen and the onStart event over into that new environment to get that set up to use. If you like what you've seen so far, please hit the like button and also subscribe to my channel so that you can see future installments. I'll see you next time.